The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and said Marjorie didn't quit because of threats, she quit because of what she saw, the entire narrative around Marjorie Taylor Greene's sudden resignation completely shifted. Because what Crockett revealed in that interview wasn't just about one congresswoman folding under pressure. It was about what happens when the machine you helped build turns its gears directly on you. And before I show you what Jasmine Crockett exposed about the real reason MTG resigned and the absolute chaos tearing apart the Republican conference behind closed doors, you need to smash that subscribe button. Because this story involves sealed files, backroom panic, and the one question nobody in GOP leadership wants to answer. What exactly did Marjorie Taylor Greene see that made her quit after just 1 week of pressure? The interview happened in one of those standard cable news studios. Bright lights, generic backdrop, the kind of setup where thousands of political conversations have happened before. But the second Jake Tapper asked Jasmine Crockett about MTG's resignation, you could see something shift in her expression. Not surprise, not satisfaction, something closer to vindication mixed with genuine concern about what the resignation actually meant. Let's talk about what just happened with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Jake opened, his tone suggesting he already knew this was about to get significant. She's resigned from Congress, effective immediately. The official statement cites personal reasons and increased security concerns, but you've been pretty vocal about having your own theories. What do you think really happened here? Crockett took a moment before responding. And when she did, her voice carried that surgical precision of someone who's thought deeply about what they're about to say. Jake, I want to be very clear about something that I think gets completely lost in all the noise around MTG's resignation. Marjorie Taylor Greene spent years building and feeding a hate machine. She amplified conspiracy theories, she targeted colleagues, she ginned up anger and violence and made it her entire political brand. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it deliberately because it gave her power, gave her attention, gave her influence in the MAGA movement. She leaned forward slightly, her expression intensifying. And then, after 1 week, literally 7 days of Donald Trump turning that same machine on her, she folded. 1 week. Think about that for a second. I've been dealing with death threats, with racist attacks, with people showing up outside my office making threatening gestures for months, plural months, and I'm still here doing my job. But MTG faced 1 week of Trump criticizing her and she's out. That tells you this isn't really about security threats or personal safety. This is about something else. Jake Tapper thrust. What do you think that something else is? Crockett's response was measured but pointed. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene finally realized that the monster she'd been feeding was going to consume her. And I think, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think she saw something coming that she didn't want to be part of. Because here's what doesn't add up. Trump went after Thomas Massie too. He went after Lauren Boebert. He went after several Republicans who signed on to the petition to release the Epstein files. But they're still in Congress. They're still showing up. They took the heat and kept going. So why is MTG different? What makes her situation so unique that she had to resign instead of just weathering the storm like her colleagues? The question hung there in the air, and Jake let the silence build before asking the obvious follow-up. Are you suggesting this has something to do with the Epstein files specifically? Crockett chose her words carefully. I'm suggesting that the timing is extremely interesting. MTG was one of the most vocal supporters of releasing those files until suddenly she wasn't. And around the same time she stopped talking about it, leadership started keeping things very tight-lipped about what's actually in those files and what the next phase of the investigation looks like. Democrats on the relevant committees, including people who should have access to this information, are being told there are ongoing developments that can't be discussed yet. That's unusual. That level of secrecy within Congress itself suggests something significant is happening behind the scenes. She paused, then added, and look, I'm not saying I know exactly what's in those files or what MTG saw, but I do know that when someone who's made their entire career on being confrontational and aggressive suddenly resigns after years of fighting, something fundamental has changed. You don't just walk away from power unless you're either being forced out or you're trying to get ahead of something that's about to hit. The interview clip went absolutely viral within hours, but it was just the opening move. Because what Crockett had identified, that disconnect between MTG's resignation and the relatively mild pressure she'd faced compared to others, sparked this massive wave of investigative reporting into what was actually happening inside the Republican conference. Reporters started pulling together timelines. MTG's last public statement about the Epstein files was February 12th, where she'd called for complete transparency and promised to fight for the truth. By February 20th, she'd gone completely silent on the issue. On February 27th, Trump criticized her publicly for the first time. By March 6th, she'd resigned. That's less than a month from vocal advocacy to complete departure. And the Epstein files issue was the thing that changed first. Then came the leaks. Anonymous Republican staffers started talking to reporters about the atmosphere in GOP conference meetings during that period. One described it to Politico as absolute chaos, people screaming at each other about who signed what petition and who was protecting who. Another told The Hill that MTG went from Trump's attack dog to being genuinely scared, and it wasn't because of mean tweets. Something happened that changed her entire calculation. The most revealing leak came from a source who spoke to the Washington Post on deep background. According to this staffer, there had been a classified briefing in late February, attendance limited to select members of the Oversight Committee, where new information about the Epstein files had been presented. The source wouldn't specify what that information was, but described the reaction in the room as shocked silence, followed by a lot of very urgent conversations about legal exposure and political fallout. MTG had been in that briefing. Within days, her entire demeanor had changed. She stopped returning calls from MAGA media personalities who wanted her to talk about the Epstein investigation. She started having private meetings with lawyers. And crucially, she stopped defending Trump on social media, not attacking him, just going completely silent, which for MTG was perhaps even more notable than open criticism would have been. Jasmine Crockett addressed these revelations in a follow-up statement that she released through social media. "We're starting to see the outline of what really happened here," she wrote. MTG didn't resign because Trump sent some mean tweets her way. She resigned because she was in a briefing where she learned something that made her political position had become untenable. And the fact that Republican leadership is working so hard to keep the contents of that briefing secret should tell you everything about how damaging the information must be. She continued, "Here's what we know for certain. There's an expanding investigation into the Epstein network and who knew what when. There are files that haven't been released to the public, and apparently some that haven't even been fully shared with all members of Congress. There are people in positions of power who are very concerned about what's in those files, and there's a Republican congresswoman who went from loudly demanding transparency to suddenly resigning in the span of 3 weeks. Connect the dots." The response from Republican leadership was telling in its defensiveness. House Speaker Mike Johnson, when asked about Crockett's statement, said only that Representative Greene's resignation is a personal matter, and speculation about closed-door briefings is inappropriate. He refused to confirm or deny whether such a briefing had occurred. When pressed about whether there were new developments in the Epstein files investigation that members should know about, he deflected. "There are always multiple ongoing investigations, and I'm not going to comment on classified or sensitive matters." That non-denial denial was, to many observers, as good as confirmation that something significant had indeed happened in that late February timeframe. As one congressional procedure expert told CNN, if there truly was nothing to the story, leadership would just say there was no such briefing, or the speculation is baseless. The fact that they're declining to comment while also warning against speculation suggests they're trying to avoid lying while also not revealing information they want kept quiet. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett kept pressing. In an appearance on MSNBC, she expanded on her theory about what the GOP chaos really signified. What we're seeing is a party that's eating itself because the lies and corruption they've been covering up for years are starting to surface in ways they can't control. MTG was never the problem. She was a symptom. The problem is a political movement that's based on loyalty to one person over loyalty to truth or country. And when that starts to crack, when people start realizing that loyalty won't protect them from legal exposure, you get exactly what we're seeing now. panic, resignations, and desperate attempts to control information. The host asked Crockett about her earlier comment regarding what MTG saw that prompted the resignation. Crockett's response revealed even more. Look, I don't have access to all the classified briefings that MTG attended, but I do know that there's been discussion in oversight circles about expanding the Epstein investigation to look at not just his network, but at people who may have helped cover up information after his death. There have been references, vague but references, to interference with evidence, to people gaining access to sensitive materials who shouldn't have had that access. One member mentioned something about henchmen going to Maxwell's cell, which sounds extreme, but suggests there's concern about evidence tampering. She paused, then added carefully, if MTG attended a briefing where she learned that the investigation was expanding into cover-up activities, and if she or people she's associated with might be caught up in that expansion,